understand the location and quantities of ground ice in order to project how an environment is going to respond to future warming with Thermokarst. So just briefly, David introduced himself. He's a professor at the University of Alberta and interested in wetland carbon cycling in the boreal and Arctic, both greenhouse gas exchange and also downstream transport. He's also been instrumental in mapping Thermokarst on a much broader spatial landscape with Thermokarst vulnerability. Merritt Turetsky is a biology professor in the Department of Integrative Biology at the University of Guelph and has played a very active role in the permafrost carbon network, particularly the Thermokarst team. She's also involved with NASA's Above project, the Canadian Permafrost Association. And if you aren't aware, she published a commentary in Nature last week on sort of the research needs and this idea that some of our preliminary data has shown that the potential feedback to climate warming could be double of what is currently estimated from simple active layer thickening. So Thermokarst can have a much larger feedback to warming, but of course, data currently are pretty sparse. And Cathy Wilson joined us on this discussion as well. She's at the Los Alamos National Lab and is a hydrologist and interested in geomorphology. She's a co-PI on the NG Arctic project and collects in situ and surface and subsurface geophysical and remote sensing data and has field sites in Alaska. And with the goal of informing, developing, and improving the representation of permafrost hydrology and geomorphology in global scale models. So with that, I will turn the floor over to, I think David is first in presenting. And we hope that this will just, their slides are designed to be an introduction to the topic, but we hope that, you know, that you will join in the discussion of this topic. And
all right.
I will mute myself.
Okay, thanks, Miriam. Thanks for inviting us. I think this will be an interesting discussion on ground ice. I think our presentation here today, so I'll go first, and then Merritt and Cathy, and then we'll have a discussion. And the purpose, as you were alluding to, is that we'll sort of stress the importance of ground ice data and the different uses we could have for it in terms of mapping Thermokarst, changes in hydrology from Cathy's sites, and also then projecting future greenhouse gas emissions. So we have a couple of examples of how we've used, or how we need ground ice data, and how we've used the current available ground ice data, at least at the largest spatial scales, right? And the discussion, I think, was going to be very geared towards thinking about how we can move forward and if there are ways that we can improve upon the data that's available. So let's see here. Okay, there we are. So I take it from the presentations that you guys are probably all quite familiar with the fact that there is a lot of ground ice up in the permafrost ground, and it comes in different forms, and it forms through different processes. And that idea then also that as these permafrost ground develops, we often have an accumulation of ground ice over time in wedges or ice lenses or massive ice deposits. And if we get more ice than we have pore space, then as these are thawing, we end up with more water than we have pore, so the soil will liquefy and we can have ground collapse, and that is the Thermokarst. And depending on where we are in the landscape and different landscape characteristics, we get different modes of Thermokarst happening. So some examples here are retrogression thaw slumps, lakes, or collapse bogs or wetlands. More than 24 landforms have been identified, right? depending on slopes and soils and soil types, for example. But broadly, you can group them into three groups of thermokarst landforms, right? You have the ones that are occurring on sort of slopes, hill slopes, or along water courses. And then you have the ones that are lakes expanding and lakes draining. And then you have the in peatlands, in wetlands, where we have thermokarst, which are these bogs and fens that form. Now, impacts of thermokarst, you have local type of impacts through influencing infrastructure or settlements or pipelines. And then you have changes to amount and quality of water. For example, our university here had a really neat study a few weeks ago where they found that these type of retrogressive thaw slumps led to really, really high levels of mercury export into the receiving waters. And then on the bottom left here, we have greenhouse gases. So that's usually where I do most of my work, and Merritt's done quite a bit of her work as well, where we're looking at, as these profiles thaw out and all the organic matter becomes available, how much of it, how fast is turned into CO2 or methane. For answering that question though, right, I mean, it's a question of the permafrost carbon feedback, and the answer is only relevant at the circumarctic scale altogether, but our study sites are very small often, and targeting these very small, where we have active thermokarst in the landscape. So the issue is really on, like, how do we go from our local measurements of this to something defendable at the scale where it matters, right, at the circumpolar scale. So a couple of years ago, through the Permafrost Carbon Network, we started thinking about these as thermokarst landscapes, and maybe we can map these different landscapes where different types of features may develop in the future. So we thought of it as the wetland thermokarst landscape, hill slope, and lake thermokarst landscapes. And then we started thinking, well, what are those landscape characteristics that makes it more likely that an area has the potential for thermokarst? So we were looking at what available data do we have and what can we at the largest scale. So overburden, so thickness of the soil on top of the bedrock, soil type, organic or mineral, what kind of slopes do we have in different places, permafrost zonation, biome, and then the last one here is the ground ice content, which is really important. So for this project, we took 4 available data sources. So we have the slope or topographic ruggedness. We have Gustav Hugelius' soils maps for the permafrost region, and then we have the biome. And then lastly, we have on the top left there, we have the map from the late 90s, which is the permafrost zonation map that you probably all have seen, but it also has, which I think you're most aware of, it also has information on overburden thickness and ground ice content. So that one was an important input to this project. Then the way how we went about was we then did what I call an expert assessment of available spatial data. And we looked at those different landscape characteristics that we think renders a region more or less likely to have much of these type of landscapes within them. So I'm not going to go through this, but there's this point system that we have for determining whether we have lots of wetland, lake, or hill slope thermokarst in any of those regions when we did the overlay of these data sources. And the bottom right then is the final result, and so here it comes up. So this was published, I guess, 2 years ago now, and I think it has a lot of strengths. I think it's a quite nice way of showing where we can expect thermokarst and the 3 different types of thermokarst landscape that we have. So we can see, for example, the wetland thermokarst are in the 3 major peatland regions, the Hudson Bay, the Mackenzie River Valley, and the West Siberian lowlands. You get more of the lake thermokarst along the Arctic Ocean coastline in the continuous, and then the hill slope is more scattered around in areas with a bit more topography and thick soils. So this assessment, we estimate that about 20% of the permafrost region is some sort of a thermokarst landscape. We're also then overlaying this with the soils carbon maps that we have. So here is from last week's publication. So this is really the map from the last slide, now with the soil carbon storage from Gustav's database. And the key message here is that once you do that overlay, most of the high carbon regions in the permafrost zone are also thermokarst landscapes. So roughly about half of the carbon in the north are in thermokarst landscapes, even though it's only 20% of the area. We've also then taken this a step further, and I don't know if Merritt, if you want to hop in here, but we are in the final stages of a project where we then actually, we summarized all studies of the implications of thermokarst on carbon cycling in order to get that estimate of the potential release of CO2 and methane from thermokarst, almost doubles the emissions that have been modeled due to just gradual active layer deepening. But of course, right, these estimates and these maps, they are only as good as the data that goes into making them, since it's based on spatial data, right? So, and one of the key things that went into making the thermokarst landscape map is this brown map from 98, but it goes back further than that, right? And this was published first, I think, in the early 90s. It was a project by IPC, right? And it's based on different national inventories that have been put together. And some of those national inventories were last updated in the late 60s. So really these ground ice data that we have in this map are sometimes based on data that's more than 50, 60 years old at this point. So anything after that has not been used to update these large scale ground ice maps. So we're thinking, what are the improvements that can be made upon this, given the 50 years of research that we have since? Where do you say, Merritt, do you want to hop in here?
Yeah, that sounds great. Nice overview, David. So what I'd like to do is carry on from what David was talking about and tell a little bit of story from a Canadian perspective about some of the activities that are going on to try to improve upon this issue. And I'll kind of weave between some Alaska and some Northwestern Canada data sets. But I want to urge, if anybody has comments or questions along the way, we welcome them now. And, as we're talking, just interrupt, and we can also come back for discussion later. So it is widely recognized by everyone on this call, I'm sure, and everyone, in our own personal networks, that this map that's still on the screen needs improvement and was a great first step. And, other groups have been trying to improve at more regional scales on this map, but clearly we need to do better than this. So David, can you switch to the next slide, please? So I just want to talk about one of those improvements, and this is coming out of Steve Wolf's group at the Geological Survey of Canada. Of course, that group have a long history of monitoring permafrost in Canada and trying to map permafrost extent and change across Canada. And this is just one of their latest efforts. So this was just published recently in the Cryosphere. It's actually very similar in principle to what David just described. This is based on an expert opinion coupled to geospatial analysis in GIS. They used a lot of the same data inputs that David mentioned. But I will say this effort in general to map ground ice extent in Canada really does a better job than anything we've done at bringing in quaternary and historical influences. So they incorporated a lot of superficial geology, glacial lake limits and moraine maps, paleo vegetation maps. And so they took contemporary data, but also some of this more quaternary influence and kind of brought it together into this expert opinion survey or expert framework to create probabilities of different kinds of ground ice. And they focus on 3 different types of ground ice that I've included here. Next slide, please. So, within Canada, this is a nice product that is now freely available for use. And within this paper and within ongoing efforts within the Geological Survey of Canada, I know that they're cross-referencing some of the modeled predictions with actual physically based field measurements. So that's what this figure is trying to illustrate here. On the top panel is, what the model shows for northwestern Canada in terms of ground ice. And again, the figures in this paper have a lot of different maps of different kinds of ground ice. I've just grabbed a few examples here. So this is showing massive ice extent in that kind of Peel area region, very vulnerable to thaw slumping. And then they've cross-referenced those modeled extents with some published field observations of massive ground ice. And the paper ends by calling on the community to do more activities like this. Take published or ongoing field observations, remotely sensed observations, and try to use it in a Bayesian way to kind of improve upon this particular ground icing map approach. So I think this is a really exciting activity within Canada. It certainly has the capacity to be extended circumpolar as well. Probably not by the Geological Survey of Canada because that's not within their mandate, but perhaps by another group. Next slide, please. Over the past 2 or 3 years, we have been throwing blood, sweat, tears, and a lot of money at trying to rescue gray data. Some of this is in the literature or in old open file reports published by the Canadian government in particular. But some of these data are actually literally buried on contractors' computers for different geotechnical projects in northwestern Canada. A lot of these new roads, borehole construction, basically any kind of infrastructure project in northwestern Canada typically has drill rig data and drill log data associated with it. The question is, what happened to those data over the past 30 to 40 years? Because those drill logs contain information that's potentially available or potentially useful for interpreting, where areas have ground ice content. So we've been trying to rescue those data. We've rescued information from about 1,200 boreholes drilled by different contractors in the Northwest Territories alone, and then data from about 7,000 boreholes drilled and maintained by the Geological Survey of Canada. We're trying to bring these all together now into a single data set. This is work largely led by Steve Coquelle as a main player, and it's funded largely by Global Water Futures, kind of an offshoot of Global Water Futures. So this is funded by the Canadian government. We're trying to do the same in Alaska. So this is work with Tom Douglas. He has access to some really interesting military data. Again, this is information that has been collected over time for a variety of projects, some scientific, some not. But whenever you go deep, there's usually some interesting qualitative or quantitative information collected. And we basically want to get those into our fingertips, get them circulated in a way that's going to be useful to the scientific community. And our goal is to eventually try to create this kind of big, larger data set that is open access to anybody who thinks they can get something helpful and useful out of it. The data are messy, they're buried, they're hidden on old hard drives in all sorts of different ways. Sometimes they're actually in file drawers. So we've spent a lot of time trying to milk good information out of these records. But I'm actually, even though it's painful to do this, I think it's really exciting, and we've gotten a lot of good insights out of it already. Okay, enough on that. So next slide, please. Another activity that I wanted to make everybody aware of, because I think it's very exciting, especially for those of you representing NASA Above campaign here. This is also a project being coordinated by Steve Coquel, but he's basically really brought in a nice team of players with varied interests in Thermokarst, ranging from the PD kind of ecosystems that David and I work in all the way up to the Thoth lumps. And we're calling ourselves the NWT Thermokarst Mapping Collective. There's about 15 of us that are all actively mapping Thermokarst features. My group is leading the peatland map, the Thermokarst and peat formation. Carolyn Gibson is actually doing a lot of this work within her PhD. But the goal is to actually use these kind of mosaic sentinel images to map all Thermokarst features across the entire NWT. We have different groups leading different kinds of Thermokarst outcomes, but we're all doing it in ways that can talk to one another. And so we think in a few years' time, we'll have a really nice record of, you know, the current spatial limit of Thermokarst and where those are across the Northwest Territories, across different kinds of vegetation and climate gradients. One of the things that this gives us, so along the way, we're also mapping areas. So the two figures that are on the right, those two photos are beautiful, the most beautiful landscapes in the north. So these are peatland rich regions. I am the queen of peat, so I get to say stuff like this. Just by, so, you know, you can see if you kind of zoom in or squint, you can see tiny little Thermokarst features inside those more brownish areas. The larger brown extent are these ice-rich permafrost peatlands. So mapping the extent of the entire permafrost peatland feature gives us an estimate of ice-rich habitat. Then we can get information on how much of that ice-rich habitat has thawed out and degraded by mapping the little fine scale features within them. And so within this mapping collective, we're getting both types of information, ice-rich habitat extent, and then the proportion of degradation that's ongoing within it today. So it's one time shot slice, but people could use those two different types of information for different purposes. Okay, next slide. Kathy.
Can I have a comment? It's Vladimir.
Yeah.
Actually, two comments. So I think, well, first of all, about this new map of
the wolf map.
Whole Canada 2019. So my comment is you have to be very careful with these maps because, this one. So on the upper left, I'm familiar with two islands there. You know, Prince Patrick and Olefeldt. It's a western archipelago, and I know there's lots of big, huge ice wedges there, which are actually now degrading. And if you look at this map, it says none. So none means no ice or no data. That's where I want to, ask you to be very careful with these maps, because it doesn't mean that there is no ice. It means that person who did this mapping, well, he didn't know that there ice is there.
No, it actually, well, so I agree with you in principle, Vlad, but I disagree with your conclusion. So it doesn't mean that the person didn't have data there, because what they're trying to do is project and simulate beyond where there's physical data. It means that the input data sets that they're using suggest a low probability of ground ice. So well, that can be true or wrong. Untrue.
That's simply wrong.
Well, so, and that's exactly what they're calling for now, is this process of kind of a Bayesian iteration where field data can kind of in a live way train the maps to be better.
Okay, so then in this case, you cannot put on map, even if it's model, you cannot say none. You can say uncertain or something else. You cannot say none, because most of the people, they don't, go too far and think about, oh yeah, it's model, maybe they don't have information, or maybe trained wrongly, and so on and so on. So they just use this map. and use for, to conclude something, and conclusions will be wrong based on wrong map. Okay,
Yeah.
so that's the first one. The
Look,
second one.
let me just jump in before you move on, because we have a number of students on the line, and I think that's a really great comment to not only be careful about how you use a map, but be really careful when you generate a map. So I'm not a co-author on this paper, so I'm not going to take these co-authors to task, but it's a really good comment coming from Vladimir, that you need to be careful what you're looking at when you're a map user. But some of you may go on to generate a map like this, so it's
okay.
Right.
And one small one, just for it's already on your part in the pitlands. Yeah, it's very good to use remote sensing to not only map thermokarst, but also say, well, if there's thermokarst, there should be ice. That's very good approach, and it's great. Again, you have to be careful, because if there is no thermokarst, it doesn't mean there is no ice. It just means it's stable.
Absolutely. Yeah, and that's why, again, we're kind of taking a number of different ecosystem types, and hopefully together the sum will be greater than the parts. But yeah, the case of permafrost peatlands is an easy one, because they always not always, but they usually have pretty high ice content. So
yeah, but there is lots of this Tasik tundra areas which definitely have ice, but they're still stable so far, and maybe
absolutely fair comment
for a while.
Exactly. Okay, let's zoom forward then, David, back to Cathy's slide. Yeah, those are great points.
And I'm going to keep it short. I guess I just wanted to then kind of take this maybe to the next step. One of the other, and well, not the next step, but one of the things that the Department of Energy in particular cares about, as do many other global climate modeling teams around the world, and that is that, we'd like to be able to project the rates at which we will lose ice in the Arctic, and then what the impacts of that will be on a whole range of things, including the carbon cycle and energy balance, but also our ability to do business in the Arctic, our infrastructure, et cetera. So I'm part of the NG Arctic project. It's the PI is Stan Wolfschlager at Oak Ridge National Lab. It's funded by the Department of Energy Office of Science, Biological and Environmental Research Program. And it's a collaborative project with many scientists working across six focus areas. And we have science questions and hypotheses associated with characterizing landscape properties, the biogeochemical processes, Arctic plant traits, the overall evolution of the ecosystem, in particular, shrubification of the Arctic. And then, as I mentioned earlier, one of the ones that I'm particularly interested in is this idea of, what controls where, when, and why different parts of the Arctic will get wetter or drier. And I think it's really, and we care about that because the moisture status of the landscape is going to strongly control the biogeochemical processes, whether you're going to be evolving CO2 or methane that leaves the subsurface into the atmosphere, as well as the types of plants that will evolve in a particular place, and their overall ability to mediate the carbon cycle. So, one of the key controls then, or we often hear about kind of the dualistic nature of what happens when ground ice degrades, or permafrost degrades and ground ice melts. If you're in these wetland ice wedge polygon landscapes that David called, the lake thermokarst regions, a lot of times, or in many cases, it's the edges of the polygonal structures the rims and troughs that where the big ice wedges are. And as those ice wedges melt out, in particular the tops of them, you can get degradation of those troughs and a lowering of the troughs and a wetting of those troughs. But you might also then drive this evolution to something like high center polygons, which are maybe higher and drier than the rest of the remaining landscape. On the other hand, what we heard about earlier is the fact that, you know, where you may have massive ice, as well as in many different forms, as well as, you know, very large ice wedges, as that ice melts, and you can get collapse of the landscape on much bigger spatial scales than the trough of an ice wedge polygon, and form lakes and ponds that can really shift a landscape from one with patterns of wet and dry areas to just, you know, wet. So where you will evolve a landscape to say high and dry versus low and wet are things that we're very interested in terms of the way it feeds back to ecosystem response and biogeochemical response in our Earth system models. Next slide, please. And so now I just want to focus on this idea of, you know, currently, if you look at, say, papers that came out of CMIP5 data and the CMIP5 class of models, many of those models projected that in general, the whole of the Pan-Arctic region is going to get drier. And there are many reasons for that. One of the reasons is something that is an artifact of the fact that the landscapes in these models are static. And if we look at the left-hand picture on this slide, you know, under current conditions, an ice-rich permafrost subsurface will prop up a water table shown in the kind of lighter blue area just under the soil surface, and support a water table that maybe is near the surface. So at 20 centimeters below the surface of the soil, you're likely to encounter a water table over much of the Arctic or right up to the surface. But one thing that's missing, if we look at the middle soil column, is that as permafrost degrades, and if we, in landscapes where we maybe have high organic matter content, it's very likely that we will slowly or abruptly get subsidence. So rather than having, you know, the same size bucket of the active layer available to for the precipitation minus evapotranspiration, the remaining water to fill up that bucket, we're likely to see that bucket is going to grow. It'll grow to the extent that it can, the deepening of the active layer is faster than the subsidence that might occur in that area. But if subsidence takes place, then it's possible, and in fact, what our models say is, well, there's no subsidence because our current generation of models can't subside. So instead, it just says we have this big bucket, and our models, many of the models suggest that the water tables are dropping because the water balance in that bucket is such that the water table only fills up to a certain level. But if in the future subsidence actually is quite significant, as we're currently observing, then we might expect that the water table will remain at the same level, or even flood to the surface if subsidence is severe. So we currently can't represent any of this in our Earth system models. We are making headway with these kinds of deformation models and exploring the role of ground ice on the status of wetness in the landscape into the future using other types of models. Next slide, please. So just as an example, and you know, right now, kind of the state of the CMIP5 class of models, and we may be a little bit better in terms of the resolution of the grid cells. And what we're looking at in this slide is just a combination of the browned ground ice percentage information and projected active layer deepening based on the CLM model in CESM runs. And if you combine those two, you can calculate, you know, a subsidence. This is the high end of a range of maps that we've produced for, say, around the year 2040. And really, this is the state of what we can currently do within our models. And the amount of subsidence that you project in a Panarctic area really is so highly dependent on the amount of ground ice from that brown map that, you know, this is the brown model for subsidence, basically, no matter what permafrost model you use on, or whatever type of physics-based model you use to calculate subsidence. So this is why we really care in NG Arctic about getting a better estimate of what ground ice looks like around the Arctic, so that we can go beyond these 1960s through 1980s to 90s data that's available and move on to something that has higher fidelity and higher resolution. So that's what I've got.
Okay, thanks, Kathy. That was great. So, you know, Kathy raised or quickly discussed a number of different modeling approaches. There are a variety of people interested in having improved ground ice maps for modeling purposes, for infrastructure siting, for making projections of the vulnerability of permafrost carbon. So across like a wide gamut of interests and questions and management issues, it seems really clear that the scientific community needs to mobilize on ground ice as this really core variable that can drive a lot of change. So over the past 3 years in the Permafrost Carbon Network, we have actually had separate breakout groups, not talking about carbon at all, but talking about, you know, what can we do as a group with our expertise in data synthesis and expert opinion surveys to kind of improve the community focusing on ground ice. And so for 3 years I've been part of this, and every year we get a little bit closer to doing something. But again, we're often not the world's experts on measuring ground ice, but we know all those people and we work with them, and we come with kind of our own expertise on how to conduct synthetic projects in a really compelling way. So this is where I'm hoping we'll go for the next 11 minutes or so, however much time we have left together. I want to really quickly walk you through a step that I actually think is important and doable, and get your comments on this. Rather than launching ourselves straight into a data synthesis on ground ice, which seems very overwhelming to me, an idea that arose out of last year's Permafrost Carbon Network meeting was the idea of kind of targeting both data providers, so people who hold ground ice data themselves through their own research, and data users, so 2 separate surveys, and asking them, you know, really simple, quick surveys, easy to complete, 5 to 10 minutes of their time, basically targeting metadata that would allow us to design a more detailed synthesis project with more information, so more wisely. So here are the kinds of questions. So this was a working group that I co-led with Tom Douglas of CREL. I don't think he's on the line right now, but we had a great hour or 2 of discussion with about 20 people around the table. And these are the general types of information. I wrote many pages of notes, but it all kind of boiled down to these broad questions. I would love to hear what people think. If you are someone who has collected either qualitative or quantitative information yourself on ground ice, what are the bits of information and accompanying information like vegetation or location? Do these general questions reflect all those bits and pieces that you think are really important, or are we missing major categories of metadata, so to speak? So we wanted to target who has what types of ground ice were people targeting, how were those measurements taken, and when? Where were those measurements taken, along with, again, this kind of accompanying metadata information. Were they taken as like a one-off, one borehole, or part of some kind of experimental design, et cetera, et cetera? Does anybody want to jump in and do you see anything that is obviously missing?
Yeah, this is Jeff Curry from the Department of Transportation. We have a bunch of boreholes from many projects throughout northern region with ice in them. One question you might want to know is, what is the format of that data?
Format of the data, yeah, exactly.
PDF of ancient history stuff, or paper files for that matter?
The paper is what scares me.
I think all of our data has been scanned into PDF format, which is still not terribly user-friendly.
Yeah. I mean, this is exactly what we're going through with that NWT data rescue project. So it doesn't entirely scare me off right now, but that's a good note, is not to focus on the measurements, but actually the data formatting.
Merritt, can I ask you a question?
Go ahead, Christina.
This is really great. Thank you very much. What is your, how much do you think there is international coverage versus just Canadian or Alaska-based data availability? Like, if we have good coverage in Alaska, we can't necessarily predict what's happening in Siberia. Do you have an idea of what the data availability would be outside of Canada and Alaska?
Yeah, I mean, most of the people sitting around my table for the last 3 years have actually been based at Avi, and so, you know, have a lot of experience in Siberia. I can't tell you what cover, you know, so I know we would get data outside of northern North America. How much coverage, I don't know, but that would be part of, I think, why this initial survey would be so useful, because, you know, if the data in Eurasia is super spotty, you know, and there's only 1 or 2, then, you know, maybe we do target a North American activity for now. My guess is we will have decent coverage in Siberia, but with a lot of gaps.
So one comment on that is, you know, the ASSW is being held in Siberia, meeting next week or in 2 weeks.
It's not Siberia, but it's okay, yeah.
I'm sorry. Can you pronounce the name of the town, Vladimir?
Arkhangelsk.
Okay.
It's north of a European part of Russia. Yeah.
Okay, but not Siberia. I'm sorry.
No.
All right. And in fact, it might even be, it's probably just south of the permafrost zone. Is that correct?
Yeah, that's correct.
Yeah, now that I'm thinking about where it was on a map. So, but I think that, you know, one of the things we might be able to do is to, well, I guess, Vladimir, do you have are you going to the meeting? I will not be able to go, but will you be going?
Yes,
okay.
I'm going.
Do you know, was it your intention to interact with the Russian members of the permafrost working group of IASC at that meeting? And maybe, or could we encourage you to ask if they're for input in terms of whether people would be interested in participating?
Yeah, sure. Yeah, and also we have 2 meetings after that. I mean, as a part of bigger meeting is T Mosaic and also Ratic. So that's where we can really discuss things.
So Vlad, that would be really great. And I guess if there aren't already membership lists with emails for those meetings, it would be awesome to get people's contact information if they were interested in participating. I think in addition to talking about the questions that are actually listed here, I also wanted to engage this group on how to disseminate these surveys broadly so we hit as many people as possible.
Right.
So
yeah, I'm involved mostly in RATIC, so yes, I have the list of people with their emails. Yeah.
Okay, great. So I'll use you as a contact for that.
Mm-hmm.
And in fact, Merritt had mentioned earlier, not prior to getting on the call, that maybe the International Permafrost Association could have a leadership role in spearheading this. I don't know, Vladimir, do you have any thoughts on that, or?
Well, I think it should.
I have small comment. The part of International Permafrost Association, there is now a working group about surface subsidence, also led by Frank Günther.
Who is it led by, Alex?
Frank Günther. He is from Alfred Wegener Institute.
Okay.
And I have comment about this slide and form. So first of all, I want to report I have a ground ice information both for Alaska and Siberia.
Great.
I have few suggestions what could be added to this form. So first of all, what kind of ground ice do we have? Is it a massive ice or segregated ice? It is important actually.
Yeah, that's sort of in there already, but maybe it could have been called out more.
Oh, okay, great. And second, I would add more information about the area being sampled, for geomorphology. Is it a hilltop, slope, what aspect, or is it like a wetland or valley? Because especially for discontinuous permafrost zone or for boreal forest zone, there is a very good correlation. So obviously, higher geomorphological forms, they have less ice. And another, so based on my data, I collected both in Siberia and in Alaska, again, for boreal forest zone mostly. It might be discontinuous like in Alaska or continuous like in Chersky area, but it's still boreal forest. There is a very good correlation of ground ice and permafrost with thickness of organic layer. Thick organic layer, it means maybe even old places and ground ice had been well preserved. And usually at the areas which had been subjected to forest fires, we have thin organic layer and we have melted ground ice at the upper part of permafrost. It still might be massive ice down. Like there's a good paper written by Misha Kanevsky, who is another very good person who has tons of information about ground ice. About studies they did at mile 9 to like 15 of Dalton Highway. Mm-hmm. They worked with Department of Transportation and drilled tons of boreholes. I don't remember, like maybe 100 of them. And everywhere they found, they didn't find any massive ice at the depth interval from the ground surface to the depth of 4 meters. And most of boreholes which goes deeper, they caught a massive ice at the 4 meters and deeper. And in 2014, working with people from Aragon National Lab, I drilled 2 boreholes at that area, and also both of them hit massive ice at the 4 meters. And from 0 to 4 meters, it was not very ice-rich permafrost.
Yeah, I think those depth issues and trends are really important. That's helpful. Okay, I'm going to ask, just in the interest of time, please email me, Kathy, or David, all of us, one of us, if you have suggestions on this survey. I'd love to hear them. I have 6 pages of notes from that breakout group that are kind of very cursely summarized here, but I've already added a couple of things that I know were not on the list. So this has been really helpful. Can we flip to the last slide? So accompanying that, survey targeting people who have collected ground ice or have summarized ground ice, there's a whole bunch of users. So particularly the modeling community, but this could include anybody using ground ice information for infrastructure, site location or management, users have a lot of interesting information and insights that the community would benefit as well. So I think this is really valuable for the scientific community in terms of how do we conduct future measurements? What kind of projections and measurements would be most valuable to these users? So we thought a separate survey targeting ground ice users or potential users would be informational. And so here are some of the general questions that we brainstormed on at the last PCN meeting. Who wants to use this information and how, for what purpose, what scale? Again, type of ground ice, I guess the depth issue comes back in here. Any thoughts on data users? Are you a potential user of ground ice information, and would you add anything to this?
Merritt, I have something to add. In terms of that second question, the scale required, I think we're all really interested in gas exchange, kind of motivated by the question of the permafrost carbon feedback. Mm-hmm. So I would say the scales, at least in terms of Thermokarst, is can we approach the scale of methane flux variability, which could be a big ask at the moment, but I think that should be a motivator in terms of understanding Thermokarst on scales at least similar to what we understand methane flux on, which are basically only at the site level at the moment, and then kind of regional, we understand regional budgets, but if we can get closer to kind of the process level scale, I think that would be huge. It may be a little ways off, but that could be, kind of a trophy that we all try to strive for. Something I'd definitely be interested in too, because we're starting to make pretty high resolution methane maps with some of the airborne techniques that we're using through above. So that's definitely something I'm going to be exploring in the future. So that's kind of my 2
I like
cents.
that idea of kind of thinking about co-associations in variation among some of these key. There's kind of a response and driver thing going on, but I think that's interesting. There would be some interesting co-associations, I think.
Yeah.
Anybody else out there?
Yeah, this is Jeff from DOT again. Conversely, for an infrastructure siting exercise for communities or for infrastructure facilities, downscale data to localized to a local scale is more important for us, and then that's a challenge a lot of the time.
I agree what scale is super important. It is also what Cathy mentioned in her presentation. For example, if you have ice wedges, you might have, if you collect sample from the center of polygon, you will have moderate ice content. If you will take a sample from ice wedge, it will be high content. But in general, for the whole area, I would call everywhere, pretty much everywhere in tundra, in zone of continuous permafrost, you have high ice content, and the gradient, is it high or moderate, will really depend on scale of sampling. So, and the same backward, if you will use you cannot downscale just model based on the limited data.
Yeah, I think.
Go ahead.
I think for this reason, earlier Alexander's comment about recording conditions where samples were taken is very important, because it's only way to have a hope to create something high resolution maps of ice content. If you will have understanding for what type of ecosystem this sample was taken from.
And I guess I would comment that certainly for anybody going out, we one thing we have talked about, Merritt and I have talked about, is this idea of having a best practices for how to take permafrost cores and samples and the notes you should take when you drill a hole in the ground or dig a pit. And so I think developing something along those lines as a smaller community would be really useful. The other thing that I think this team in general, or people who are interested in trying to build this next generation map, we probably need to give some thought to what is required to do the kind of machine learning analysis that would give us the best possible map in terms of the covariation of ground ice from the few samples we'll have, because we're never going to have it everywhere, with the conditions at the site. In a way, you know, we've talked a lot about ecotype interactions with ground ice and so forth. So there's surface, there's shallow subsurface, and there's deep subsurface, like quaternary geology information. All of that matters. And so, you know, trying to build up this picture of what data do we really need to do the best kind of calculation and interpolation of ground ice across diverse landscapes for this next map. And I think we can do that. We just maybe a little more thought in terms of what would go on the survey form. That would be useful. Now, not everybody's going to have all the data we need. And we did mention, Merritt, also this idea that some people may just have cores in a freezer, in which case we want to have that question on the list too. You may not have ground ice, but do you have a core in a freezer somewhere?
Yeah.
I was going to say, just adding on to what Cathy said with machine learning, something that I know I've learned, and I think Jeff will echo this, is that the variability in sampling, even within small areas, especially in the discontinuous permafrost zone, can be very high. And so if we're talking about sampling methods, that's something that could be highly beneficial. And when we apply more complex models, can absolutely be trained into it. And it would be clever to do that. It would also have a lot more applications on the infrastructure side if that was included.
Yeah, absolutely. Okay, this has been awesome. Please, if you didn't have time to sneak in your comment, email me or any of the other co-presenters if you have inputs into these surveys. But I think these two ideas for the two different surveys work really well together, because I think we can do an initial pulse on what types of data are out there floating in the gray literature or in the published literature. How have they been sampled and where, and then we can match that to who wants the data and how do they want to use it and at what scale. And my guess is we will find that there are some mismatches, and that's obviously, if that does occur, it's helpful to get those out into the open as soon as possible to inform future studies. I think I am going to try to give myself a bit of a kick in the butt, and maybe by the NASA Above meeting in a couple of weeks, I will even try to have a mock-up of some of these questions in kind of monkey survey form to test out to various people going to that meeting. So I say that in public, it's recorded.
Well, thank you very much, Merritt, Cathy, and David, for your presentation. I think a lot will come out of this, so it was very fruitful, and I hope everyone else listening on the phone agrees with that. And like Merritt said, if you have any further comments or information you'd like to pass on, please email any of them or any of us in the Permafrost Team Leaders group here at IRPIC. And we'll be sure to pass that information on. So thanks again. This has been a really great meeting. So thanks for joining.
Thanks, Miriam.
Thanks.
Thank you. Bye.
Thanks.
Everyone.